I want to talk about using brain mapping to frame a story, and yes, and you can too. My name's Steve Johnson. I'm from the University of Florida, and this came out of a really cool class that we have called Creative Storytelling. We try and push the boundaries of what is a story. If you want to follow me, Journal to Go or the hashtag JIConf, I'll be tweeting some of these slides throughout. But first off, I am not a neuroscientist. I just want to make that very clear. I'm not a doctor. If this presentation goes significantly longer, call your doctor. But I am not a doctor. So when I started working on this course, we hit the fundamentals of what is a story. But before that, we hit the fundamentals of how do we plan a story. And we usually plan a story, we get a tip, we find something out, right? We start to ask a bunch of questions, and then we start to report. And this is a phenomenal method. We've done it with the inverted pyramid, we've done it with the 5 W's and the H for the history of journalism. But these are all things that are pretty linear. It's stuff that narrative science at Northwestern is doing really well with computers. So we wanted to say, how can we start to frame a story in a way that our brains are already wired to consume it? Insert our brain. I'm not going to get too crazy complex, but the part that we were most interested in was the prefrontal cortex. That's why we all have giant foreheads, so I'm going to grow my bangs out now. This part of our brain starts out when we're developing as a simple yes-no, if this, then that. If I touch the stove, it's hot, then I won't do it. It took me a few times to learn that. And as we grow, it becomes this really complex part. It's the reason why we don't walk into a club and pull a night at the Roxbury thinking we're going to get a date that night, right? So these very complex decision-making processes, and our audiences have these too. So we wanted to think, how can we think about this part of the brain when we're coming up with what type of a story do we want to tell? Can we draw a map out of this, right? So there was this phenomenal research, and I've tweeted this out of UC Berkeley, that uses fMRI machines. And fMRIs measure the blood flow in your brain. And in real time, these poor subjects, they subjected them to hours and hours and hours and hours of movie trailers. And they measured the blood flow through the brain for all of these hours, and then they created 1,700 different categories. Think of these as proper nouns: bird, tree, animal, person, friend, family member. And they built this map of your brain. And they built the first map, and this is actually not the most recent, this came out in 2012. And they built this map that shows you the different sections of your brain and how you can actually see where they relate to. And we've all talked about categories. The cool part is you can actually go online, and they built this interactive tool, and I just tweeted out this link. You can actually go through the brain and explore the different sections of the brain that lights up with these different tools. Now, the left side is really cool and sexy and pretty. What we really used was the right side. So if we were doing a story on plants, insert marijuana debate here, what are the fundamental aspects of the brain that we're going to start to think about as we want to tell a story about this type of plant? So we have these categories because we have these giant foreheads that developed, right? When our ancestors saw the first woolly mammoth, I bet they're like, oh my gosh, look, it's a furry animal, I should touch it. And then it killed someone, and they were like, you know what, we're gonna change that category, right? Because like Ted's dead, like gone, like tusk right in, like we need to protect ourselves, right? So this is wired as human natures. We break up into these categories, and we have these sections as a survival mechanism. So that means we understand these stories really quickly. It's why we had cave paintings. So here's the you can too part, the takeaway. So let's talk about a story that's big in the state of Florida right now, and let's talk about marijuana. And this is a story that one of my students brilliantly covered this semester. And we said, all right, let's using these maps, what are some base angles of marijuana, right? You've got safety, you've got kind of the perception of what it is, you've got the, the economics of it. And then, yes, pun intended, what are some of the higher level angles of this story? And how can we start to chart out different ways that we can tell this story? And you go, all right, this is great, but where are the next steps, right? Going from that map. Well, let's start to connect all of these different things, from politics to federal law to perceptions to the economies to small business to loans. And as our students started to do this, and a lot of this research ahead of time was figuring out what does our audience already know about marijuana? What are their perceptions? This was pre-reporting. This was before they even found an angle. And I said, wow, growers, that's it. And we figured if we want to hit all of these really complex subjects, and we want our audience in Dixie County, Florida, who probably doesn't have that higher level education that we can't find through just scoping through data from our websites, we can say, all right, I bet if we start this story about a farmer and a family in agriculture and how that ties to this complex issue that someone has to vote about, now we found a solution. And using this if this then that in a much more complex way. But at the end of the day, One last thing. Some really cool tools to do this. We used a lot of iPads too and Postit Notes. Even Postit has an app where you can take a photo of your Postit Notes and then start to rearrange them. So this makes it really useful. And one thing I would definitely recommend as you do this, in this kind of kinetic way of learning, write this out. It's easy to do on a slide, but have your students write this out. And we've done this with ideation before, and word maps and different ways to come up with ideas. But then start to fundamentally categorize this and use colors and use lines, and it might turn into, you're going a little crazy with the red yarn in your room, and you're like, oh wait, I've got the idea, it's brilliant, right? We've all done that before. And the purpose of this is, from a fundamental level, we want to think about planning. We've done this idea of the who, what, where, when, why, how, and the most important information first, and we're coming into an age now where these stories can be told for us by machines, and that's okay. How can we start to reach our audiences in different and more impactful ways so we can spend less time thinking about, oh my gosh, I have to engage my audience, right? And say, wow, we've planned our story where the awareness factor is already there. We don't want to make our audiences aware about things. We want to create actionable journalism that people can take information from and do something with it. That's ultimately our goal. And so we found through this semester a lot of experimentation, a lot of failure, #fail, that it worked in some stories. And in other stories, we realized, it really didn't. This was either too complex of an issue or too simple of an issue that we didn't need to go through this trouble. But as you're working on some of these longer form stories, think about ways that you can think about your audience and those different levels and how they connect those levels and see what starts to show up based off of, yes, that crazy red yarn going through your office.